Today's video lecture topic is going to be how energy flows and how nutrients cycle, the cycling of matter. As always, please make sure you are filling in your notes organizer as you go through the video. There are going to be several times today where you will need to stop and you're going to need to draw pictures. Do not skip that part. You will not be able to use your notes on the homework check unless you have those pictures. And those pictures are really going to help give you a visual understanding of how these different cycles flow. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the water, nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus cycles. Some of these cycles you're going to be more familiar with, and then some of them, this information is probably going to be pretty new. So the first thing I want you to think about is I want you to think about Albert Einstein. Okay, I want you to close your eyes. I want you to take a deep breath. Do you feel any smarter? And the reason I'm asking that is because the matter and energy that exists today is the same matter and energy that existed when Albert Einstein was, drawing his famous conclusions. So the first thing I want to discuss is why. Why do nutrients need to be cycled? Well, in simple terms, there is a fixed amount of energy and matter that exists in the universe. So because there is only a certain amount of matter, and remember matter is anything that takes up space or has mass, it has to take on different forms during different processes so that it can continue to go around and around and around. Okay, we need nutrients, we need matter for different things at different times, so there has to be these processes that get matter through those different forms. Okay, so what's in it for me? Why in the world am I studying this in biology, a life science class? Why am I studying these physical science sort of processes? Well, you remember that the building blocks of life are cells. And you remember that the building blocks of cells are proteins. And you remember that the building blocks of proteins are amino acids. Well, as it turns out, that the critical components of amino acids are the elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So we're going to look at some of these elements and how they cycle, because the way that they cycle is really important to living organisms. We need these elements in different forms at different times, so they have to be able to cycle through the different states of matter. The first cycle we're going to look at is probably the one you're most familiar with, the water cycle, also known as the hydrologic cycle. So as I go through the different cycles, there's going to be several pictures for each. Feel free to stop and pause on any of them and answer the questions. So like, for example, number 2D says, pause the video and draw the water cycle. You can stop on any of these pictures, but take the time to do that. Okay, so the water cycle describes this continuous process by which water molecules move through their different forms, from bodies of water on land, to living things on Earth's surface, back to the atmosphere, and then back to Earth's surface. Why is this important? You know that most of the Earth is covered in water, but as it turns out, and we've discussed this before, only a tiny percentage of that water is fresh water, and an even tinier percentage of that fresh water is available as drinking water, because most fresh water is frozen. So there has to be a way to get the water through the different forms so that we have enough water on Earth for living things. All living things require water. Okay, these are the different forms that water can take on during the water cycle. So take a minute to define each of these on your paper. Evaporation is when you go from water as a liquid form to water as a gas form. Okay, the surface of a liquid absorbs enough energy to change it into a gas. So evaporation is the creation of that water vapor, the gas. Transpiration is simply evaporation that's happening inside of plants. So water going through the leaves of plants, it's a specific type of evaporation. That's transpiration. Condensation is when you go from that water vapor gas to the liquid. So the water vapor is condensing back into the liquid form. So up in the atmosphere, this is taking place in clouds. You see this happening on your Coke cans, right? So you're going from a gas to a liquid. That's condensation. And then finally, once water condenses enough and it gets too heavy, then you have the water form falling back into the earth in the different forms, right? We usually think of rain, but it could be sleet, it could be hail, it could be snow, depending on what the temperature is. That's precipitation. Okay, so there's a picture you could stop on so that you can understand how the water cycles through. And then we're going to continue on to the nitrogen cycle. So this is going to be a cycle you're a little more unfamiliar with. So pause, stop, replay for anything that you don't understand. Okay. As it turns out, nitrogen, when you think of the atmosphere, you probably think of oxygen, right? But as it turns out, most of the atmosphere is actually nitrogen. It's about 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. But the problem is that the form that nitrogen is in the atmosphere, atmospheric nitrogen, is not a usable form for plants and animals. It has to be changed so that it can be used by plants and animals. So that atmospheric nitrogen has to be what's called fixed. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle is looking at that movement of nitrogen through the atmosphere back to the earth and then back to the atmosphere. So this is going to include these 4 main processes: nitrogen fixation, digestion, decomposition or denitrification, and then finally elimination or waste. Okay, so these are the different parts of the nitrogen cycle. You can stop on any of these pictures and use this to draw number 3H. So like I said, the process of turning nitrogen from that unusable atmospheric form into a form that plants and animals can use is called nitrogen fixation. You have to fix it. It's the process of capturing and converting nitrogen into a form that's usable by living organisms. Okay, there are several ways that this can be done. You have bacteria that are capable of doing this, so you call them nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Lightning can do this, and we're going to talk about each one. Lightning can fix nitrogen, and then humans are able to do this through the use of human factories, but it turns out that it's a pretty expensive process, so we really rely heavily on the natural processes of nitrogen fixation. The first one we're going to discuss is lightning. So remember, nitrogen is in the atmosphere as N2, atmospheric nitrogen, and it's unusable. But as it turns out, that lightning, which we know is extremely high in energy, has enough energy that it can actually blast those nitrogen molecules apart into the usable nitrogen form. And then when it rains, those usable nitrogen atoms are carried down to the soil where it can be absorbed, used, or consumed by the living things there. Okay, there are nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So there are bacteria that are capable of fixing nitrogen that's in the atmosphere that's unusable and turning it into a usable form. A lot of these nitrogen-fixing bacteria are actually in symbiotic relationships with plants. Some of them are just sort of free-floating in the soil, but a lot of them are actually in these little nodules in certain plants. Plants you're probably even familiar with, like alfalfa or different legumes like beans, peas, and corn, clover, soy. Okay, so they have these nodules that are full of this nitrogen-fixing bacteria. The bacteria inside the nodules fix the nitrogen, so now it's into a usable form. And they're in the roots of these plants, so then the plants can just absorb that nitrogen and get whatever they need. So what farmers will actually do is they'll grow these crops in cycles in order to return nitrogen to the soil. So it's sort of like a very natural way of fertilizing or making very rich soil. So here's a critical thinking question for you. What type of symbiotic relationship is this between the nitrogen-fixing bacteria and these different plants that have them growing in the roots? Okay, the plants are getting the nitrogen that they need in a usable form. What do you think the bacteria are getting from this relationship? What do plants make? They make sugar, right? So bacteria are getting food that they need, so it would be an example of a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. Okay, here's some definitions for you that you need on your notes organizer. Digestion: the animals eat the plants that are full of the fixed nitrogen, so it breaks down, in their stomach. Elimination is when animals release waste. Okay, they poop. The waste are loaded with that fixed nitrogen, which returns it to the soil. This is why manure is such a fantastic fertilizer. And then you have denitrification, which is that process of taking the fixed nitrogen and returning it to the soil and to the atmosphere. So denitrification. Okay, there's a picture you can pause on to get the picture that you need. Make sure you do that. And then next up we have the carbon cycle. This is a cycle that you should definitely be familiar with. We've reviewed photosynthesis and we've reviewed cellular respiration, which are critical components of the carbon cycle, the cycling of the carbon atoms. Remember, carbon, all living things are made up of carbon, right? That's super important. So let's review. What is the purpose of photosynthesis? The purpose of photosynthesis is to use energy from the sun in order to make food, which is glucose for the plant, right? Glucose has carbon in it, C6H12O6. Takes place in the chloroplast. What is the purpose of cellular respiration? The purpose of cellular respiration is the opposite, right? Taking food, glucose, and breaking it down in order to form energy in the form of ATP. Where is that taking place? In the mitochondria. So plants have both chloroplasts and mitochondria. Animals only have mitochondria. So the carbon cycle is this complex series of processes through which all carbon atoms rotate. Where can you find carbon? You can find carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You can find carbon in rocks like limestone. You can find carbon in dead organic matter, decaying organic matter, right? Because all living things have carbon, so when it's decaying, you still have carbon in it. And then you can find carbon in deposits of coal, petroleum, and natural gas. And we're going to talk about fossil fuels in a second. How does carbon enter the biotic environment? So remember, carbon is carbon dioxide out in the atmosphere. So how does it get into the living portion of an ecosystem? It gets into the living portion of an ecosystem through photosynthesis, right? So plants take it in, and then either those plants use it, or those plants are consumed, or the animals that consume the plants are consumed, but either way, it enters the biotic environment through the process of photosynthesis. And then it returns to the atmosphere through the process of respiration, right, either at the cellular level or just by animals breathing, through decomposition, or through the burning or combustion of carbon. Now, humans have had a really significant impact on the carbon cycle. We've removed photosynthesizers, right? There's been a lot of deforestation, a lot of cutting down of plants. So that's going to take away organisms that can get carbon dioxide into the biotic portion of an ecosystem. And then we've also burned fossil fuels at a very quick rate. And we're going to talk about why that is significant. So like I said, carbon is brought in through photosynthesis, and then animals and plants return the carbon during respiration. The plants and animals die and can eventually become what's called fossil fuels. So over, hundreds of thousands or millions of years, these fossil fuels that go deep into the soil sort of compact, and eventually, through natural processes, they would decay and the carbon would return to the atmosphere at a very, very slow rate. But what we're doing as humans is we're burning those fossil fuels, which is returning that carbon back into the atmosphere at a very fast rate. So remember, you can pause on any of these and get the pictures that you need for the carbon cycle. So what's the big deal with burning these fossil fuels? Well, we need a very delicate balance of gases, and what we're doing by burning fossil fuels is we're putting way too much carbon back into the atmosphere, much more than what would happen naturally. Naturally, the carbon would get returned, over millions of years, but we're burning them and putting carbon into the atmosphere at a very fast rate. And what that's doing is causing what's called a greenhouse effect. If you've ever been inside a greenhouse is trapping heat energy, which is why they stay nice and warm all the time. So someone who wants to grow plants even in the winter is going to have a greenhouse, right? Because they can trap the heat energy, they can grow plants all year long. And so we think that this is, what's possibly leading to climate change or global warming. We're trapping too much carbon, or we're releasing too much carbon into the atmosphere, which is trapping heat energy. So basically, energy from the sun is sort of bouncing around in that carbon-loaded layer of the atmosphere, and it's warming up our entire planet. That's a significant impact that humans have had on a cycle of matter, on the carbon cycle. So here you can pause on the picture, get the picture that you need for the carbon cycle. So last we have the phosphorus cycle, which is going to be most similar to the nitrogen cycle, but the biggest difference between the phosphorus cycle and all the other cycles is that the phosphorus cycle doesn't have an atmosphere component. So there is no phosphorus in the atmosphere. That's not going to include part of the cycling. Okay, so you have really two parts of the phosphorus cycle, one long-term cycle part and one very short-term cycle part. The long-term involves the geo processes, the geologic processes like weathering, whereas the short-term phosphorus cycle involves the cycling of phosphorus through living organisms. Okay, so the phosphorus cycle is a sedimentary cycle by which phosphate goes from organic to inorganic molecules, right? So from living things to non-living things. Phosphorus is an essential nutrient for animals and plants. So why are we studying this? Why is it important? If you remember, phosphorus is a key component of ATP, which is a form of energy, right? We need that ATP to do certain processes. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. You know that phosphorus is a critical component of DNA. You know that DNA is made up of sugars, nitrogen bases, and phosphates, right? That makes up the backbone. Phosphorus is an important part of lipids, and lipids are fats used for many different things. Okay, so the phosphorus cycle. Over time, rain and weathering cause the phosphorus trapped in rocks to be released into inorganic material, so inorganic phosphate, non-living things. The inorganic phosphate is going to be distributed into the soil and the water, which is where plants are going to take it up through their roots, right? So plants take up inorganic phosphate into the soil, and now it's entered the organic portion of the cycle, living things. So the plants are either going to use it, or they're going to be consumed by animals, or animals are going to consume the animals that eat the plants that have the phosphate. When a plant or animal dies, they're going to die and decay, and the decomposers are going to return that phosphate to the soil, right? Now we're in the short-term portion of the phosphorus cycle. Bacteria are going to break down the organic phosphate back into inorganic phosphate, And then the phosphorus in the soil is going to end up back in the water, and then you continue on through the cycle. So you're going to want to pause on this video to get your picture. You can go back a couple slides or do that picture too. Either way, it doesn't matter. And that concludes the cycling of matter. If you have any questions, this is tough material. I've got lots of tutorials on the blog that will help you out. Have a great day.